Okay, we'll be recording today's presentation for the benefit of those who are not able to participate in real time. Thanks for joining us here on WebEx, on Finger Lakes Television, Spectrum Channel 1304, Facebook, or YouTube. And greetings also to the students, faculty, and staff who are viewing this from the lecture hall, room 2775. If you are joining us online, please make sure to hit the mute button until the Q&A portion of the program, which will follow Colonel Jacobs' presentation. I'm Dr. Robert Brown, professor of history here at SUNY Finger Lakes Community College and organizer of the college's History, Culture, and Diversity series. As we approach Veterans Day 2023, we at Finger Lakes Community College are extremely humbled and honored to welcome into our midst Vietnam Congressional Medal of Honor recipient Colonel Jack H. Jacobs. Colonel Jacobs is a native of New York State. He was born in Brooklyn in 1945 at the tail end of World War II. His father was a U.S. Army veteran of that conflict and served in the Pacific Theater. Colonel Jacobs holds bachelor's and master's degrees from Rutgers, and in 1966, he entered the U.S. Army through the university's ROTC program. He served as a platoon leader in the 82nd Airborne Division, executive officer of an infantry battalion in the 7th Infantry Division, and commanded the 4th Battalion, 10th Infantry in Panama. Okay. Colonel Jacobs deployed twice to Vietnam between 1967 and 1972 and served in the field as an advisor to Vietnamese infantry battalions. For his distinguished service in Vietnam, Colonel Jacobs earned 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Silver Stars, and the Congressional Medal of Honor, this nation's highest combat decoration for valor. He received the latter for his actions in Quang Phong Province, Vietnam, on March 9th, 1968. And just to give you some perspective, there were 8.7 million Americans who served in the armed forces during the Vietnam era, only 268 of which received the Medal of Honor. On October 9th, 1969, then Captain Jacobs was invited to the White House to personally receive the Medal of Honor from President Richard Nixon. And here is the accompanying citation to that award. And I will read this for those of you that can't see it. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life and above and beyond the call of duty, Captain Jacobs, then First Lieutenant Infantry, distinguished himself while serving as an assistant battalion advisor, 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry, 9th Infantry Division, Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The 2nd Battalion was advancing to contact when it came under intense heavy machine gun and mortar fire from a Viet Cong battalion positioned in well-fortified bunkers. As the 2nd Battalion deployed into attack formation, its advance was halted by devastating fire. Captain Jacobs, with the command element of the lead company, called for and directed airstrikes on the enemy positions to facilitate a renewed attack. Due to the intensity of the enemy fire and heavy casualties to the command group, including the company commander, the attack stopped and the friendly troops became disorganized. Although wounded by mortar fragments, Captain Jacobs the Allied companies ordered to withdraw from the exposed position, established a defensive perimeter.
I want to support Bob and watch this, but at the same time,
despite profuse bleeding from head wounds, which
I'll have to get to my office and put on the Faculty Alliance meeting.
Could someone mute that, please? Despite profuse bleeding from head wounds, which impaired his vision, Captain Jacobs, with complete disregard for his safety, returned under intense fire to evacuate a seriously wounded advisor to the safety of a wooded area where he administered life-saving first aid. He then returned through heavy automatic weapons fire to evacuate the wounded company commander. Captain Jacobs made repeated trips across the fire-swept open rice paddies, evacuating the wounded and their weapons. On 3 separate occasions, Captain Jacobs contacted and drove off Viet Cong squads who were searching for Allied wounded and weapons, single-handedly killing 3 and wounding several others. His gallant actions and extraordinary heroism saved the lives of 1 U.S. advisor and 13 Allied soldiers. Through his effort, the Allied company was restored to an effective fighting unit and prevented defeat of the friendly forces by a strong and determined enemy. Captain Jacobs, by his gallantry and bravery in action, is in the highest traditions of the military service, has reflected great credit upon himself, his unit, and the U.S. Army. After more than 2 decades of military service, Colonel Jacobs retired from the U.S. Army as a full colonel in 1987. He was inducted into the U.S. Army's Hall of Fame in 2020. Colonel Jacobs subsequently had a distinguished career in the world of finance after leaving the Army, first as the Chief Operating Officer of Auto Finance Group, Inc., then as a Managing Director of Bankers Trust, and currently as a principal of the Fitzroy Group, a firm that specializes in the development of residential real estate in London. He also serves on the boards of directors of numerous charities. As if this wasn't impressive enough, Colonel Jacobs has established a notable presence in academia, serving as a member of the faculty of the National War College in Washington, D.C., and as the McDermott Chair of Humanities and Public Affairs at the U.S. Military Academy. He is currently a distinguished visiting professor at Rutgers University. In 2011, Colonel Jacobs was, in 2011, Colonel Jacobs became an Emmy nominated on-air analyst for NBC News, a role that I understand, continues to play. You might in fact see him on the air tonight or tomorrow on NBC, analyzing the current crisis in the Middle East. Colonel Jacobs was also a member of the team at NBC that produced the Murrow Award-winning nightly news segment, Iraq: The Long Way Out. Colonel Jacobs is the co-author of an outstanding memoir, which was published in 2008, entitled If Not Now, When? Duty and Sacrifice in America's Time of Need, which was published by Penguin and was the winner of the Colby Award for Outstanding Military History. It's a fantastic read. You can see in the reviews on the back cover, and I can personally attest to its merit. I'm reading it for a second time as we speak. He's also published a second nonfiction work called Basic: Surviving Boot Camp and Basic Training, which was released by St. Martin's Press in 2012. Well, I'm sure you want to hear from Colonel Jacobs himself. So it is my distinct pleasure and honor to present a true American hero, America's finest, Colonel Jack H. Jacobs.
Thanks, Dr. Brown. Thank you for the kind words. And, you know, we throw around the term hero all the time, and we have to keep it all in proper perspective. Somebody once asked another Medal of Honor recipient, Bob Kerrey, who, as you may recall, was the governor of Nebraska for a couple of terms and was a U.S. Senator from Nebraska. He was a Medal of Honor recipient in Vietnam, lost his leg as a Navy SEAL. Somebody wants to ask him, what does it take to get the Medal of Honor? And he said, well, you need to do something. People have to see it. They have to be able to write, and they can't hate you. Those are the requirements. You think about all the people in the history of this country, maybe 40 million who wore the uniform of this country, many of whom fought in combat, many of whom died, giving us the freedoms that we have. And you realize that it takes a great deal to accomplish something on the battlefield, but nobody does it alone. What would happen if somebody performed valiantly and nobody saw it? Or somebody saw it and the witnesses themselves were killed. There was nobody left to witness it. Or, and this has happened frequently, people did see it. They made the recommendations, but either accidentally or on purpose, those recommendations were lost. And you realize that all of us recipients, we say the same thing. We we don't wear the award for ourselves. We wear it for all those who can't. And poignantly, one of the recipients who died recently, the last recipient from the Second World War, Woody Williams, who was a young kid, a young Marine on Iwo Jima, would touch his medal when he wore it at an event and say, this medal is not mine. I just hold it in trust. Now, all of us would say the same thing. You're not in it alone. You're never in it alone. And you're all together. You're all together actually in the action, and you're all together forever. In any case, Dr. Brown talked about my starting out in New York. I was born in Brooklyn while my father was overseas. He had been dragooned out of the University of Minnesota, where he was studying electrical engineering, something like 8 or 12 weeks before graduation in 1943-ish, 1943. And thrown into the Army and fought in the South Pacific, in New Guinea and the Philippines, fought in the Battle of Manila, hated getting dragged out of school, hated the Army, hated getting shot at. Nobody likes getting shot at. Got out of the Army the instant that he could when the war was over. And yet when he got to be my age, all he would talk about was how proud he was at having saved the world. And he was right, and his generation had saved the world. You don't realize it when you're young, the kind of contribution you can actually make, and often don't realize all the opportunities you had when you were young to make a contribution. You don't realize that until you're too old. Dr. Brown and I were talking before we got started about the notion of time. If you're young, you have a tendency to procrastinate. I forget who it was. It was poet Edward Young, English poet, who once said that procrastination is the thief of time. He's absolutely right. I have to constantly defend against wasting time and doing what I'm supposed to do and what I know I should do. It's a constant battle for many people, including people who are really good at not wasting time. They still have to battle. When you're really young, it's difficult to convince young people that they shouldn't waste time, because in their view, time is an unending series of days that disappear over the horizon. I have to do it today, I'll do it tomorrow, and I got the next day, and so on. I'm only 18, 19, 20 years old, 30 years old. I got the rest of my life. And then when you get to be old and decrepit, like I am, every day goes faster and faster. I've determined why that is. It's because every day is a larger and larger percentage of what you got left. Nobody lies on his deathbed and said, well, you know, I should have wasted more time. That's what I should have done. Nobody does that. And it's something, it's extremely difficult to enjoin kids to do the right thing with time. And it's hard work getting them to do it. And we all did it. We all did it. And we rue the day that we did that, all that time we could have spent. That's why old people don't sleep. You sleep a long time someday. But it's difficult to believe that we spend, at least a third of our lives unconscious. I mean, think of all that time we wasted. In any case, I spend a lot of my time when I talk to students trying to get them to realize that the time to do whatever they're going to do is right now. And it doesn't do any good to rue what happened yesterday, because you can't fix yesterday. You can only fix tomorrow. In any case, my father had left, gone to fight. I was born while he was overseas, and when he came home, I was 8 or 9 months old. We lived in a house in Brooklyn with about 7 bazillion other families on a street that looked a lot like the set in Meet Me in St. Louis. It had a trolley running down Tompkins Avenue, and there were sycamore trees and wrought iron fences and so on. And of course, all that's gone. In the late 40s, they built these housing projects in Queens and in other places to house returning veterans, which, by the way, was everybody. And we lived in an apartment there until the mid 50s. My parents bought a house in New Jersey for $15,000. We all moved into it. My parents lived there until they died. It's interesting to note that in my neighborhood, and this was true everywhere in the United States, everybody, every household had made a contribution to the defense of the Republic. I didn't have any friends whose fathers had not served. I had friends whose fathers were missing arms and legs and eyes. I had friends who had no fathers at all because their fathers had been killed in action. Everybody had served. Today, for a wide variety of reasons, we've decided to outsource the defense of the Republic to a very small number of young men and women who are willing to do it. Now, you're looking at somebody who believes in universal service. I think if you're lucky enough to live in a free country, you owe it something in the form of service. We don't have the political will to do it, but we need to do it. Think of the countries that do have universal service. Finland has universal. In Switzerland, you have to serve until you're 56 years old in the reserves. The United States, which has more enemies in number, more enemies in population, a wider variety of obligations around the world, we don't have universal service. We don't have the political will to do it. I mean, think of 9/11 just as a case in point. More people were killed in New York City on 9/11 than were killed at Pearl Harbor. That on the 8th of December, 1941, hundreds of thousands of young people streamed off to reception stations around the country to go defend the Republic. And by the way, this was in a country that had, for at least a decade, said that we're not going to fight. As recently as the previous fireside chat, the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, said, we're going to let Asian boys fight in Asia, European boys fight in Europe. I hate war. He says, President of the United States, I hate war. He said, Eleanor hates war. His wife, Eleanor hates war. He said, Fowler hates war. You know who Fowler was? His dog. He's making an address to the United States of America, and he said, my dog hates war. We're not going to fight. And there were quite a few people, prominent people, who were arguing strenuously that we should let the Nazis do whatever they wanted. When we entered the war after being attacked, the war in Europe had already been going on for 2.5 years, and people were getting slaughtered. People were getting slaughtered on 2 continents. The war in Asia had been going on for at least a decade when we finally entered the war. And yet, on 9/11, more people were killed in New York City. And I'm an equal opportunity castigator, so don't take anything away. Don't assume anything from whatever I say, whether I'm castigating Republicans, Democrats, independents, or anybody else. But the President of the United States said after 9/11, go back to your homes. He said, do something, go to a shopping center and go buy something, go spend money. That's what he said. He didn't say, let's go defend the country. There's something I find it all very uncomfortable that we can't motivate ourselves to do something individually, to do something for the country. And when you talk to people, say, well, I pay my taxes. No, that's not it. After all, that's not what it's all about. And I hate to think that we will rue the day that we do not engage the majority of people in serving their country in some fashion. But I'm old, and maybe I'll live long enough not to see it. In any case, I joined the Army at least partially because I thought that, and I still do think that you need to serve. I went through ROTC for a couple of reasons. The first was and don't do this, if there are any students here, I'm talking to you. I got married when I was very, very young. That's not a good idea. And I needed the money, and they paid you $27 a month in ROTC, which wasn't even a lot of money back in those days. When I was graduated and I was commissioned as a second lieutenant, I made $222.10 a month, which was, I think, in constant about $2,000 a month now. And I had a wife and 2 kids by that time. But the principal reason I joined was because I thought it was my obligation to serve. My intention was to go in and do I had a 3-year obligation and then get out and go to law school or do something similar. But I stayed. And I stayed because I really loved the people and I didn't want to leave them. And today, and by the way, left reluctantly, only because I was at a cocktail party and somebody offered me more than the $40,000 a year I was making as a colonel in the Army to get out and go to Wall Street. But today, when people ask me, what do I miss most about the Army? It's the people. And I always feel better when I'm around people who have served or who are serving, and I try my best to do that. And I try to do as much as I possibly can with veterans and for veterans. A lot of people do that whether they've served or not, and it gives everybody a good feeling to do something to assist those people who are out there right now defending us. Well, we're enjoying ourselves. But it's something that in particular makes people who have served, makes them feel really good. I got out of the Army only because I was offered some, I was literally at a cocktail party, and some guy who had been in the Marine Corps for about 8 years and then left to go to the family business on Wall Street told me that I should retire and he'd teach me the bond business. And when I got home, my wife said, "But what's the bond business?" I said, "I have absolutely no idea, but it's 3 times what I'm making as a colonel in the Army. I'm going to retire." I had already put my daughter through college. She went to Rutgers too and graduated in '86. I had a son in college at Virginia Tech, and my youngest son, who's now a lawyer, would have to go through college, and I couldn't afford to be in the Army anymore, and so I said yes. How did I make the transition? With enormous ease. If you've already had authority and responsibility at an early age, which you do when you're in uniform, there's nothing that anybody can put in front of you that becomes too difficult. I mean, you work it out, you figure it out, and it was not difficult to do that since, like I said, you've had all this authority and responsibility. I told the guy who hired me out of the Army, I said, "Let me see if I get this straight. You're gonna pay me about 3 times what I'm earning in the Army to learn something, and nobody's going to be shooting at me. I mean, how hard could this be?" And the answer is, it's not hard at all. I talk to CEOs all the time, most of them major corporations, and we talk about hiring veterans. Bear with me a second. This is NBC driving me crazy. Okay, ignore. Not until 2 o'clock, so I'm good. What was I talking about? I was talking about getting out of the Army, wasn't I? All the things that I needed to know to be a success in civilian life, I learned in the Army. And when I talk to CEOs, and they say, "Well, we want to hire vets." I'm very good. Why do you want to hire veterans? And invariably, they'll say, it's sort of the Judeo-Christian guilt response. We owe it to them. Well, yeah, I guess in a kind of grossly subjective and almost superfluous way, yeah, you do owe it to them. But that's not the reason you should hire. These are people who've had more authority and responsibility at an early age than anybody else, probably including the senior people in your organization. You take somebody who's been a squad leader, which is pretty much the lowest level you can be in an Army infantry unit, who has been responsible at some ridiculously young age for everything in the lives of 10 other people. Training them, keeping them safe, making sure they get paid properly, making sure their families were okay, everything, making sure they got fed and were taking care, everything in the lives of 10 other people at 20, 21, 25. there's nothing you can throw at this person that's going to be too difficult for them. Nothing. Probably take over your job with about 10 minutes notice and probably do a better job than you. And then the light bulb goes on when you talk to these people. Say, yeah, geez, I hadn't realized that. 75 years ago, this wasn't the case. Remember when I was talking about everybody had served? That generation participated in and presided over the biggest increase in our well-being, economic well-being, and you could argue strenuously social well-being in the history of the United States. And one of the reasons was they knew that they could get it done. It's, what do we got to do? Nothing could be more difficult than getting shot at in the Philippines, right? So we're going to get, and they did. And I think one of the things we're missing now, because we do not have universal service, is a recognition among most people that you can do anything. All you got to do is roll up your sleeves, do a little studying so that you know what it is you're supposed to do and go ahead and do it. Well, enough about that. I want to talk a little bit about, and Dr. Brown, you got to give me the hook when we get close enough to take questions, because if you leave it to me, I'll keep talking until I fall over backwards, foaming at the mouth, and I'll have to sweep me up and put me in a dumpster and so on. Some of the things that you learn when you're in the military establishment are the kinds of things that are vitally important no matter what you do. We are taught, and those of you who've served and studied the military know that this is true. I don't know whether we call it this anymore, but we used to call it the principles of war. There was a mnemonic we had to remember so that we could remember the principles of war, and I still remember it. But in any case, there were 9 of them. There were things like economy of force. Don't throw everything at the objective all at the same time. Use the smallest possible number and volume of assets, because you need to keep stuff in reserve. People forget this all the time. We make mistakes like this in business, in government, in our personal lives. You got to keep stuff in reserve. And people forget sometimes why you need to keep stuff in reserve. In Israel right now, we can see why you need to keep assets in reserve, because you can't predict the future. And so you'll never know when you'll have to commit your reserve. So you have to keep something in reserve. But what people don't realize is that there's another reason for keeping a substantial reserve, and that is to take advantage of successes. I'll tell you a brief combat anecdote. This is my second tour in Vietnam. I think it was about December of 1972. I was senior advisor to the 1st Airborne Battalion of the Vietnamese Airborne Division. And we made an attack on a hill about 600 meters to our front. Intelligence back in those days was not nearly as good as it is today. And so our higher headquarters made a guess that there was about a company, maybe 120 enemy on top of that hill. Nowadays, we have satellites and drones. You can tell exactly where everybody is if you're paying attention. We were wrong by an order of magnitude. There was a regiment. There were 1,200 enemy soldiers on top of the hill. And when we attacked it, we lost 47 of our battalion killed and another 35 or 40 wounded. In any case, it was very, very unpleasant, as you might expect. But we managed to prevail, and we got on top of the hill, and now we held the hill. And what the next higher headquarters should have done was to commit the reserve they had so that we could take advantage of the success. Instead, it did not. Division kept the reserve because they didn't want to commit it for whatever reason. 2 days later, we had to defend against a counterattack by 2,000 enemy. They drove us off the hill. We ran all the way back to where we had started, 600 meters away, 2 days earlier, and in the process lost another 35 or 40 killed and another 50 wounded. And now our entire battalion was combat ineffective and had to be replaced. And the independent variable here is not the lack of valor by individual soldiers or the lack of a good plan by our whole battalion. Was a great plan and we succeeded. But the failure to commit the reserve to take advantage of success. And we should remember that in everything that we do. Keep a reserve by all means. Commit it when you have to. And one of the ways to commit it is to take advantage of success. But if you do commit the reserve, you have to reconstitute it with other assets because you can never be without a reserve. We have to remember this and everything. And this got reinforced when I was in the banking business on Wall Street. I mean, that information that I learned as a young soldier stood me and Bankers Trust in good stead when we had financial situations that were similar. One of the most important of all, matter of fact, I would say the most important of all of the principles of war is the principle of the objective. You can't get any private, no-class dogface to do anything unless you first tell them what the objective is. What is it you're trying to do? So you have to tell him what the mission is. And everybody in the chain of command must know exactly what it is you're trying to do. If you keep it a secret from anybody in your organization, it will not be accomplished. They need to be motivated by and know exactly what it is we're trying to do as a unit. Because, and by the way, it's called an objective. I mean, you'll know it when you get there. You'll know when you will have achieved it. Otherwise, it would be called a subjective, which it isn't. Any vague instructions are no good unless you articulate what it is you're trying to accomplish. I'm reminded of an observation by Lewis Carroll, who maybe we shouldn't talk about since Lewis Carroll was an alias, and I don't know how much we should talk about people who use aliases, and I'm not so certain about his relationship with Alice's niece and all that. All that notwithstanding, in Through the Looking Glass, I think it was, he wrote, "If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there." Duh. But we ignore it all the time in almost everything that we do. Think about assets that our government has thrown at objectives, which weren't really objectives at all. I'm reminded of every once in a while they declassify tapes that are from the White House. And some years ago, some decades ago, the transcript of a meeting in the Lyndon Johnson White House had been declassified and published. And the meeting was among Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States. I don't know if the Vice President was there. Probably not. The Secretary of Defense, I think some of the service secretaries and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but the Secretary of Defense at that time was Robert McNamara, who was highly regarded as a really smart guy and had served in World War II. He had been a statistician in World War II, and then eventually wound up running Ford Motor Company and brought some semblance of scientific observation to every job that he did, including being Secretary of Defense, which actually didn't stand us in good stead at all, because instead of making strategic decisions based on what was important strategically, the Defense Secretary and his establishment always came back with some numerical answer to a question, which is not often the right answer in any case. And William Westmoreland was in. William Westmoreland was a four-star general, looked great in the uniform, and had been the superintendent of West Point in the early 60s, and was now, at the time of this meeting in the White House, was running all of our forces in Vietnam. Yeah. And the purpose of the meeting was to listen to Westmoreland's briefing. And Westmoreland wanted, and I'm making the numbers up, but they're instructive in any case, even if they're wrong. He wanted 100,000 more people in Vietnam, 100,000 more troops. And went through his briefing and so on. And McNamara's whiz kids, the Secretary of Defense, said something like, well, we can't give you 100,000, but we can give you 38,500 or some other number. What did Westmoreland say? What would you have said? Well, I'll tell you what Westmoreland said. He said, I'll take them. Now, either 100,000 is the right number or 38,500 is the right number. They can't both be the right number. And Westmoreland's problem, McNamara's problem, and the problem with the entire National Command Authority during the war in Vietnam, and by the way, in other conflicts since then, was an inability to stipulate what the objective was. Because unless you know what it is you're trying to do, you will never be able to figure out what assets you need to throw at it, what kind of assets and what their numbers ought to be, in what phase sequence they ought to go, and so on. I mean, if you contrast that with, let's say, D-Day, we knew exactly what we were up against, or we surmised based on the intelligence. We knew exactly what the objective was. We knew what the intermediate objectives. We knew everything about what we wanted to achieve. And as a result of that, we could make a pretty good calculation about what we needed to throw at it. We decided in the war, in the Second World War, for example, that we had two fronts, don't forget. We were in Europe and we were also in the Far East. We had inadequate resources to achieve both of those objectives at the same time. And so we made a conscious decision that we were going to defeat the Nazis first before we defeated Japan. And we allocated our resources specifically to do exactly that. Without making that determination, the war would have gone on forever and we would have lost another 1 million people trying to invade Japan and so on. Lord only knows what the outcome would have been. It would not have been as good as it was. But one of the things I took from, and people who serve in the military took from the Army, was the principle of the objective. You got to first say what it is you're trying to do before you allocate resources in order to accomplish it. And if you don't do that, you have everything that you do. The results are going to be arbitrary. You may achieve them, you may not achieve them. You won't even know whether or not you've achieved anything because you haven't articulated what it is you're trying to accomplish. Resources really, really important. Achieving the objective really, really important. One of the most important things that we do in the military establishment is we make some terrible assumptions. And the assumptions that we make is that the leadership is not going to survive or will otherwise become incapacitated. And I've been in enough combat to know that that's absolutely correct. And so you have to do a number of things. Not only do you have to make sure that everybody knows what it is we've got to do, you've got to train people to take over leadership roles, if, as, and when they have to. And I'm telling you from experience that they'll have to. At some juncture, some young kid is going to have to do something he was not trained to do. And unless you develop his leadership ability, unless you give that woman the capability, the understanding of what needs to be done to do it when she has to, it's not going to get done. One of the things that distinguishes the American military establishment, for example, from the Russian military establishment is exactly that. Russians haven't changed, and I'm not being insensitive to Russians. Russia hasn't changed in 1,000 years. Whether it's Ivan the Terrible or Putin the Great or any of those other people, it's all top down. And you can see it in what's happened inside Ukraine. They have no non-commissioned officer corps worthy of the name. And they have non-commissioned officers, but they're not allowed to do anything. Their officer corps below the rank of colonel is not authorized to do anything. They're just to follow directions. Yes? So when they get the order to go to this point and then make a right, they will keep trying to make a right until they're all dead. You take an American unit run by young American troops, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guard, whoever it happens to be, and you say, okay, take your unit and go there and then turn right. And they can't turn right, they'll turn left. They'll find a way to accomplish the mission. And successful military establishments, indeed, successful organizations of any type, do their best to mentor young people, teach them everything that you know, and encourage them to take up leadership positions, because it's at some point you're not going to be there to do it. I'll tell you an anecdote about that. During the Korean War, as Medal of Honor recipient, now deceased, named Ron Rosser. Ron was a private in the Army. I mean, at the bottom of the food chain. They had to take a hill in front of them. They went up the hill. The Chinese were holding the hill. Went up the hill. Half the unit was killed or wounded going up the hill. They ran back down the hill to where they had started. They got the order to go back up there again. Up they went again. Half of the half was, they were left with about 25, I think 25 or 27 soldiers out of an entire company. They're still down at the bottom of the hill. Ron Rosser, who's a private, goes up to his company commander, who's a captain, who's behind a rock, and says, "Sir, we gotta go up that hill." He said, I can't take them up there. I can't do it again. We'll lose everybody. And Ron Rosser said, and I knew him for 50 years before he died. Ron said, "No, sir, we got the order to go up there. We got to go up there. Because if we don't go up there, the units on our left and on our right," don't forget, everybody knew what the mission was. Even the mission of the units on their left and right. The units on our left and our right, they don't have a chance, because the enemy will have a salient into our position, and our sister units on the left and right are going to get annihilated. We got to go up there. His company commander said, "I can't do it." And Ron said, "Well, I'll take them up. I'll take them up there for you." And he said, "How are you going to do it?" He said, "Well, we're going to have to go straight up shooting. There's a trench line about halfway up the hill. If we make that trench line, we've got a chance, but we can't stay down here. We'll all die and they'll all die. We got to accomplish the mission." He said, "You're not going to make it." He said, "Well, I'll try." And he led the remnants of the company up the hill. When he got to the trench line, there were 6 people left. But they took the hill. They took the hill, and the units on their left and right were saved. I think the lesson of the story is not the indomitable courage of Ron Rosser or anybody else in that group. It's the notion that we know what it is we have to accomplish, and we're going to find a way to do it. You do not find that in very many organizations, but teaching younger people how to act in difficult situations, giving them the tools to accomplish the mission, even when it's difficult and their leadership is not around. The ability to seize leadership when you have to. These are all things we have to teach people who work for us. And one of the major things that we learn when we're in uniform is that's one of our principal job actually is to do exactly that. To train people who are lower in the food chain to seize control and get things done. We have to do it in all walks of life, in the banking business too. I mean, and when I was in the banking business, we encouraged everybody to do exactly. Mentorship is really, really important. If you yourself close your eyes and think about who really influenced you. You come up with one or more people who you would today consider to be mentors. It's vitally important that we perform, especially people who are old professionals. That's what we do. We got to make sure that we mentor the next generation and succeeding generations. Well, I think I've yacked on enough for a while, Robert. What do you say by the way, I have an opinion on absolutely everything. So, you can ask me about anything, and I'll tell you what I think. I'm at the age now where I don't care what people think about me. So.
Well, thanks very much for that. Let's open things up for questions. If you're on WebEx, you can unmute and pose your question directly to Colonel Jacobs or type something in the chat. And if I see anything there, I will I can read it to Colonel Jacobs on your behalf.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I would like to know one or two of your mentors that were most important to you.
Well, I've had a lot of people who've helped me out, either teaching me things I should know directly or indirectly. I'll tell you a very quick story about my freshman calculus class at Rutgers. It was 5-credit calculus. So it was 50 or 55 minutes a day, 5 days a week. And all full professors had to teach freshmen. I got the head of the math department for some inexplicable reason. They all drew lots, and I got the head of the math department. Professor Joshua Barlaz, now gone, had been a refugee from Nazi Hungary. He went to a selective high school in Budapest where, of those people who survived, and not very many of them survived, half of them got Nobel Prizes. I'm exaggerating. It's hyperbole, but it's like that. It's that kind of place. And he had a unique teaching style. He'd walk in, survey the class, and begin writing equations on the blackboard. Right. You get to the corner, there's another blackboard. Right. Saying nothing. Keep writing equations. Every once in a while, he'd point to something he saw he'd just written on the board and look at us and go, Keep writing. It's a bank of windows. Go over to the next board. Right. Equation. He got to the door 55 minutes later and walked out. Now, there are a couple of lessons here. The first was, this is not recommended pedagogically for everybody, but it certainly worked for him and therefore worked for everybody else in the class. The first was you had to do enough work before you got into class, because otherwise you didn't understand anything he was writing on the board. Nothing. Which meant that you better read the assignment before you got into class. Because otherwise you're sitting there for 55 minutes trying to figure out what planet you're on. And you're wasting your time and you're wasting your parents' money. Although at Rutgers, tuition was $400 a semester. And I had, by the way, when I was graduated, I had an outstanding student loan balance of $1,760, which took me 10 years to pay off. Don't forget, I was making $200 a month. In any case, so the first thing was do the assignment before you get into class. Don't sit in front of a camera on NBC and be completely blindsided by the questions that, no, we're in the middle of a war and that you better study up before you get on. Don't go into a meeting at Bankers Trust without knowing exactly what your people are doing, what your profit and loss is, what your exposure is, be prepared. Secondly, if you wanted additional instruction and you walked into his office, the first thing he would ask you was, what don't you understand? And if you said, I don't understand anything, he'd throw you out. You at least had to do enough work to know what you don't know. And if you don't do that, you're not serious. You're just not a serious person. And he's not going to waste any time with you. If you said, look, I got it to here, and then there's this finite gap discontinuity, and I don't know how you got from here to here. He'd spend all day and half the night with you, giving you additional instructions so that you were a serious person and you were vitally interested in what he was. A huge mentor of mine. I had a battalion commander when I was a lieutenant in the 82nd Airborne Division. His name was Hans Druner, now gone. His family had come over in the interwar years. He was an enlisted glider pilot on Normandy, managed to survive, got a battlefield commission, and jumped into Nijmegen as a paratrooper as a company commander. The bridge too far, managed to survive. He had an extremely low threshold of pain for wise-ass lieutenants like me, who thought they knew more than they really did, and got my attention early on. Ultimately became a very good friend of mine when I thought I was being really smart and I was just being really stupid. And he mentored a lot of young officers, just not only lieutenants, but captains. And I mean, a battalion's got 750 people on it. And became a mentor of mine because A, he was so experienced. B, all of his experience was achieved under enormous duress and therefore made a huge impression on him and then subsequently on me. And 3, he knew that I would have to use whatever I learned later on when times got tough. And he was absolutely correct. We have to think about that as mentors. I mean, not today. It's tomorrow that we have to worry about what do they need to know tomorrow, next year, 10 years from now. Those two people were enormous mentors of mine, and I learned more from them than I did from almost anybody else. Matter of fact, almost anybody else combined, everybody else combined. But I'm a million years old, and I'm still not too young. I'm still not too old to learn, and I do every day.
Thank you so much.
I've got a multi-part question for you that stems from your rather unique experience being, embedded in a South Vietnamese military unit, acting in an advisory capacity. The first is, what was your opinion of the fighting efficiency of the ARVN? Because that's something that's been subject to all kinds of debate, sort of then and now. Did your experience in that capacity inform your perspective on the war that you were fighting in a way that might differ from sort of a conventional all-American military unit? And then just one last thing, and this is the big question. Having served in the military, having served in Vietnam, in a crucial point at the war, Tet Offensive, and then the sort of wind down, and then going into sort of the private sector and academia, have your views about the Vietnam War fundamentally changed since then?
Well, it's very interesting. When you're at the bottom of the food chain, your view of what the war is like strategically is skewed. Matter of fact, you have no view of it at all. Somebody once asked me, what did you think about the protests when you were getting shot at? Because I wasn't thinking about the protests when I was getting shot at. I was thinking about defeating the enemy and taking care of my people. That's all you think about at the bottom of the food chain. So yes, your perspective changes, but only because your perspective changes. When you have a few minutes to sit down and think about strategically what it was like and what it should have been, rather than what it was tactically, which does not, what it is tactically does not inform anything strategically, and vice versa. Because the two are, though they're inextricably intertwined in a cause and effect relationship, if you want to get really smart about strategy using tactics, you have to think about it for about a decade and study it really, really hard. My view of the Vietnamese units was the following. I happened to be with a very good Vietnamese unit both times, with a first line infantry battalion in my first tour and a Vietnamese airborne battalion, the cream of the cream, my second tour. They were as good as they could be, but still not good enough. And one of the reasons, there were a couple of reasons why they were not good enough, and the United States was one of them. We taught them all the worst things to do because we didn't want to be there in the first place. And so we would we contact the enemy, I'm talking about American units, contact the enemy, drop bombs on them, and then leave. I'm reminded of the observation of Seinfeld, of all people. Remember the time when Seinfeld and Elaine are going to rent a medium-sized car? And they go to the desk of the medium-sized car company, says, I'm here to pick up my medium-sized car. And they said, well, we don't have a medium-sized car, but I made a reservation for one. Well, but we don't have one. He says, you obviously don't understand what a reservation is all about. I think we do, sir. No, you don't, because if you understood what a reservation was for, I'd have a medium-sized car. Well, sir, you don't realize what a reservation is for. He said, no. He said, listen, anybody can take a reservation. Take a reservation. Anybody can take a reservation. But you got to be able to hold on to the reservation. And holding on to it is what it's really all about. We took lots of terrain in Vietnam, but we never articulated what our objective was. And as a result, strategically. And as a result, tactically, we never did either. We took lots of objectives and gave them all up. Now, you could argue that there was no way that we would have the political will to stay in Vietnam and control all of Vietnam, that there was no way that we'd be able to work with what was effectively a corrupt government in Vietnam in order to make it all work. All cogent arguments. But at the end of the day, if you're gonna sacrifice over 58,000 people, you better know what it is you're trying to do. And we didn't. We didn't know. We could not relate what we wanted tactically with what we wanted strategically. And so even while you're there, you realize that it's not working out very well. And in retrospect, obviously, it's clear, it's intuitively obvious to the casual observer that it wasn't going to work out. Today, as it transpires, we're one of Vietnam's biggest friends. I mean, they love Americans. They want us to help them out. This is a country that defeated China in a war in 1972 and now wants our assistance to keep them at bay. Times are different now, but they were very much different back then. Sorry to carry on.
No, that was great. There's a question in the chat. You said everyone can and should serve the country in some way. What are some ways we can help if we don't want to go into the Army?
I want you to go into the Army. You must go into the Army. You know, it's kind of interesting. You'll get a little bit of acquiescence, and people say, "Okay, all right, I don't have to go into the Army. I agree that we have to have national service, but if you don't have to go in the Army, I want to empty emesis bowls in a hospital." Who's going to decide who gets shot at and who doesn't get shot at? I mean, it's all subjective. So the easiest way to do is everybody goes into the Army. Now, there are ways to do it, and there's no time for me to talk about ways to do it which are not onerous. But suffice it to say, we don't even have the political will to have universal service of any kind, even if nobody goes into the Army. Okay, everybody is going to be part of the Department of Public Works in the town, and that's going to be your service. We don't even have the political will to do that. But I want to see everybody in uniform, at least for a short period of time, because then we don't even have voting in common. We have nothing in common. I would like to see it whereby everybody has had something in common, and that is in some fashion serving the country. We don't have enough time to talk about a variety of plans to have everybody serve in uniform, but who makes the decision that somebody is going to sweep streets and somebody else is going to get shot at? I mean, other countries that have universal service don't have that problem. Israel doesn't have that decision-making problem. Everybody serves. Well, not everybody serves, and that's part of their problem. They have a problem with the far right wing and so on, but we don't have time to talk about that either. But so if you're going to make decisions based on arbitrary criteria, the decisions are going to be arbitrary. I'm something of an absolutist. I'd like things to be completely and totally objective. Another time we'll talk about it another time when we have time. We got a minute or two.
Yeah. There's some more in the chat. Does anyone on WebEx otherwise I'll read another one in the chat. Here's one. During and after the Vietnam War, many people resented the U.S. for entering the war. I was wondering what reaction Colonel Jacobs received, presumably when you came home, and if he was disappointed or surprised by the public's treatment of returning soldiers.
I'll answer that from my own experience and that from other people's experience who I've heard. A lot of friends of mine got spat on. The public tends to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So I mean, these poor people were dragooned into the military. So to castigate them is the height of stupidity. It just shows that you're ignorant. I did not receive any opprobrium from having served. Indeed, in 1970, the Army sent me to graduate school. I went to Rutgers, a hotbed of leftist action. I went to Rutgers between 70 and 72 to get my master's degree. Everybody knew I was a captain in the Army and received absolutely no opprobrium whatsoever. So it's disappointing that most people, no, I shouldn't say that. What disappoints people most of the time, including me, is ignorance. And the trouble with ignorance is that ignorance is curable through education. And all of us have a responsibility to ensure that everybody around us is properly educated. And in particular, people in positions of authority and responsibility, politicians, people in the media, and so on, they have an added responsibility because their audiences are larger. But everybody is impressionable. And unless we make sure that everybody understands, is educated properly, we will continue to have problems, and the problems will increase. These people who thought that were annoyed about the war took out their annoyance on people who had served and who had no choice but to serve. That's ignorant. We have bigger problems with ignorance today, and we all need to do a better job of making sure that we eliminate ignorance as much as possible.
Matthew, you have your hand raised. Please go ahead and pose a question. Can't hear you. You have to unmute. There. Nothing.
Are you talking to the room, or?
It's,
Just ask the question.
Sorry about that. It's not working.
no, it's Matthew Callan on WebEx. He's unmuted, but his microphone is not.
Listen, you people are all really young, and you should be. You're all really young, and you should be the people I call on to help me with my technical stuff.
Are you the one that's talking?
Matthew, do you want to put it in the chat? In the meantime,
I'll ask a question if that's all right.
wait, I've got Wayne Thompson with his hand up from Finger Lakes Veterans Advocacy Council.
You're muted, Wayne.
Hi, Colonel Jacobs. First of all, I'd like to thank you for everything.
So much for that.
Actually,
Need to win, and do you think they will win? I think you're muted.
Yeah, say that again. I didn't catch all of your question.
I said, do you think Ukraine has everything they need to win? And do you think they will win?
Ukraine doesn't have all the things they need. They need more anti-aircraft weapons, more anti-tank weapons, more ammunition. They're low on artillery ammunition and on missiles and so on. They might win. And the reason they will not win is if the West gets tired and distracted. And Putin is counting on that. He's got all the time on his side. He figures that eventually the West will get tired of supporting Ukraine, and he'll just be able to walk in ultimately, or at least force a negotiated settlement that will give them all of Donbass and all of Crimea, hold on to all of Crimea, and maybe a land bridge to Moldova. But don't forget, you're talking about an autocrat who has total control of his internal affairs against, on one hand, and on the other side, democratic institutions with people who can't figure out how to pass a budget, and they get tired of writing checks, even though the checks are not that big in the giant scheme of things, and who have very, very short memories. Russia doesn't have a short memory. They have a lot of patience, and it's an autocratic society. And in the end, if the West blinks, Putin will win.
Thank you.
yeah, I think we have time for one more quick
One
question.
more only, then I got to run.
Yep.
Any euros? Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead.
What is your honest opinion
of the United States Marine Corps versus the Army?
You mean at the Army-Navy game or just?
No, just the Marine Corps. We don't need to talk about the Navy.
You know, it's interesting. There's a not a groundswell, but there's an undercurrent about eliminating the Marine Corps, which will never happen, because the Marine Corps does not have a mission any different than the Army. What we forget is that the Marine Corps has no trouble recruiting people, and the Army does. I think the Army came up 25% short in its last recruitment period. The missions are similar. Indeed, in the Second World War, they were identical. Most people don't realize that the large majority of amphibious operations in the Second World War were conducted by the United States Army, that Okinawa was an Army operation, and so on. So they both served a useful purpose. One of the things that the Marine Corps does that the Army doesn't have, it doesn't have the luxury of doing, is stationing people on ships and have them everywhere, have at least somebody where we need them afloat when we need them. And so I can make a cogent argument that we need both of them, and we just need more of them.
Okay, well, we better wrap things up so Colonel Jacobs can get to his NBC News commitment. But thank you very much, Colonel Jacobs, for your outstanding service to our country and for spending time with us today, giving us some of your insights. We'll look forward to seeing you on the news tonight or tomorrow morning.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me, and all the best up to Finger Lakes. Thank you very, very much for having me. Cheers.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for coming.